So last week we were examining some changes in nation states. So sort of the consolidation of empires both in the New World and in the Old World, particularly in Europe. And we were looking at the French Revolution, which we said had three phases. The first phase was the constitutional monarchy, and so the French Revolution begins in 1789. But as we mentioned, there were many reasons for the French Revolution, including when you think about the divine right of kings, the idea that kings could make decisions on various affairs, such as the French king deciding to be involved in the American Revolution and spending quite a bit of money, and then the French treasury was broke, and so the king needed to figure out a way to raise money. He tried selling offices, he tried reconsolidating the debt, and so that didn't quite work, and so he called the Estates General to Paris in 1789. We also saw that there were three estates. The aristocracy, the clergy, and the commoners. So kind of if you think about today's three social classes, like the upper class, the middle class, I think in this country you hear a lot of references to the working class in the French context. And actually in most of Europe, there were three classes kind of divided that way. And so the commoners, as we might refer to them, decided to go to the adjacent tennis court. They came up with the tennis court oath, and this kind of became the basis for the sort of French Revolution, a new constitution, the rights of man and of the citizen that we said were fashioned after the United States constitution. And so we mentioned that the first phase was the constitutional monarchy, and that lasts between 1789 and 1792. So it was kind of a mix. So there was the king, there was also the National Assembly, and so part of the major outcomes include, for example, the Catholic Church being subjected to civil law. And so we might remember that before that the church was kind of above the law. And so the phase one constitutional monarchy, so the monarchy ruled together with the National Assembly. The second phase becomes the radical republicanism. So by 1792, the Republicans take power, and so they thought that this whole sharing of power was not effective, and so they wanted to change how France was governed. So they get rid of the king, actually guillotine him, 1792. The guillotine is invented in 1791, so he was one of the first victims. And so again, the king and queen attempt to flee, but they were actually discovered. Guess they didn't disguise themselves very well. It's a very well known flight to Varennes, and so they were returned. And after that, the king was guillotined in, I think it was in February 1792, and then the Queen, Marie Antoinette, in 1792 in September, I believe. And so again, you begin to see the royal politics. So for example, Marie Antoinette was a princess of Prussia, and Prussia was going to intervene, but eventually they did not. So the murder of a monarch is generally known as regicide, rigor regicide. And so this is what happens to Louis the 16th. His son, who was 7 at the time, is often thought of as the French King Louis the 17th, and then Louis the 16th brother will then take power after 1815. And we're briefly going to talk about the revenge of the monarchy. But so the radical republican phase goes on for 3 years, so 1792 to 1795. And so predominantly Maximillien Robespierre was the one who was kind of in charge during this radical republicanism, introduces the reign of terror. We talked about the one crime, treason. So almost everything was considered treason. Now, so the French do a few changes which were sometimes very mind-boggling. For example, they do away with religion. So, for example, Maximilien Robespierre called himself not an atheist, a deist. So you believe in God, but you don't believe in the sort of Christian God. And so he introduces this cult of the supreme being, the idea that there was a supreme being who was God, but wasn't the Christian God. And so this is part of, so some people were moving in the other direction. They were talking about atheism, talking about the cult of reason, that we do away with religion and we only focus on reason. But so the French also do some other changes during the radical republicanism. For example, they change the week, so it has 10 days, as if 7 wasn't long enough, and then they changed the months, and so July was month number 1. Um, it yeah, they were doing some things that were a little extra, but so this begins in 1794, and it's sort of like, now we're going too far, maybe we should maybe moderate what we are doing. And so by 1795, Maximilien Robespierre is actually guillotined himself, tries to shoot himself, but doesn't actually die. So then he is guillotined anyway. So I guess Palmer knew where he lived and came to get him. But some other things were important to sort of think about during this period. So the French decide that liberty actually means that you cannot enslave people. Now, you remember that the French owned Saint Domingue, today's Haiti. And so in 1791, they decide to abolish, actually like 1793, abolish slavery and decide that everyone is free and equal, and so on. And so you can see the revolution in France happening and igniting the revolution in Haiti. Haiti will eventually become the first Black majority independent Western nation. But actually, before slavery was outlawed in 1793, Vincent Oggi, we'll talk about him a little more. He was a mulatto who was in France, and so he sees this French Revolution taking place, and he thinks, why can't we have freedom in Haiti? So Haiti was very interesting, Saint Domingue, because it had a population of about 600,000, give or take. 500,000 of them, 500,000, were African enslaved persons. 30,000 were white French people, and 30,000 were mulattoes. And so some mulattoes were actually enslaved. And so Vincent Oggi, even though he was a free man, he sort of thought that maybe freedom is a good thing, and he decided to go back to Haiti and start a revolution. He was unfortunately arrested, and he was eventually it's three things. It's drawn, quartered, and something else. I think hanged, drawn, and quartered. So they hang you, make sure that you don't die. Then you are pulled behind a horse, and then you are quartered. You are basically cut open. They burn your insides while you watch. and then eventually they kill you, maybe, or you die. Sometimes they would also get horses and tie your limbs, and the horses would go in different directions. So if you think about the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, it refers to cruel and unusual punishment. These were some of those punishments that existed then. There was another one that was called being broken at the wheel, or at the Catherine wheel. And so, if you've watched these westerns where they have these wagons and they have like large wheels, there's differing explanations as to what being broken at the wheel is. One explanation says you'd be tied to the wagon wheel and every bone broken. There's 206 bones, so that's yeah. Or like they would take the wheel and just tie you down and break every bone. So these there are these reasons why cruel, unusual punishments amendment is so important. But so this is portraits of the French king and queen, and you might note that they were actually married at 15 and she was 14, and at 39 they were murdered. So gruesome photos of or representations of, for example, the Louis XVI being guillotined, and this might be Marie Antoinette being guillotined. And for some reason, they would then put the head on a pole and show it to the crowd, which made no sense. So I'm not certain what to say about the guillotine, but the French stopped using it in 1976. So not too long ago. Again, if you sort of think about nations and how they think of themselves. So this is the cult of the supreme being. So there was belief in the existence of a god and immortality of the human soul. So this became the new French religion, so that it was supposed to replace Catholicism or reason or atheism or other. So sometimes change can be too much, and in the case of the French, it seemed like it was too much. And so this is not something you need to remember, but so some of the cult of the supreme being's ideas, and again, it's a rejection of religion. So to replace Catholicism, the idea was it was going to be replaced by the cult of reason, so no gods worshipped. The guiding principle was supposed to be fidelity to the idea of reason. Yeah, so um, Robespierre was the kind of the guy who was in charge, sort of did not think that not having a god was a thing, and so he comes up with this quote of the supreme being, and so its tenets were a belief in the existence of a god and the immortality of the soul. Being civic minded is a public virtue, sort of like the highest virtue. And so virtue is attained through active fidelity to liberty and democracy. So if you sort of think about this as the religion, how do you know someone is religious? But Robespierre is eventually kind of, immortality of the soul, practice of man's duties, detestation of bad faith, tyranny, punishing tyrants. Now, again, I want you to remember Maximillien Robespierre and his Republicans reign over the reign of terror. If you do something that you think is not virtuous, then you are guillotined. So about 30,000 people are guillotined, including himself. So he is killed during the month of Thermidor, which is like July of year one. Yeah, and then he is executed on 10 Thermidor. So again, now when he is executed, this is seen as maybe like a coup, and so the idea is that they are replaced by the directory, which was like 5 people. And so they 5 people who rule, and they are sort of beginning to return France to some of those traditions, like, get rid of the 10-day week and the thermidor and other things. Now, I introduced Napoleon Bonaparte here because eventually Napoleon was the army commander. And so he eventually decides that even the directory isn't doing a great thing. And so in 1799, he overthrows it and decides that he's going to become the ruler of France. And actually, he doesn't just become the ruler of France, he becomes in 1804, he's actually crowned the emperor of the world. Now, I want you to sort of think about how things are connected to each other. And so one of the things that were connected to each other is, this is heroic Beethoven Symphony Number 3, which was composed in honor of Napoleon's coronation. This is his coronation as Emperor of the World in 1804. And so to imagine that Beethoven actually composes this for Napoleon's coronation is an interesting idea. And so in thinking about after he is crowned and he takes over France, so some people will say that he came to power through a coup d'etat. And so he decides to bring France to like normalcy. And so some of the things that he does is he eases religious restrictions, put security and order ahead of reform. He moved away from the idea of the French constitutionalism. Again, remember, he has crowned himself emperor of the world, not just of France, it's like of the world. And then he puts a legal civic code. He also restores Catholicism, so it's maybe return to normalcy. He restores the civic code, Catholicism, equality of all people, again becomes emperor of the world, and then starts conquering other countries. For example, he takes Egypt in 1798. He decides to invade the Iberian Peninsula. And so again, Napoleonic Wars, you will have heard of Napoleonic Wars, are interesting in that Napoleon causes the Brazilian, or rather the Portuguese kingdom to move to Brazil. So from about 1807 to about 1821, the Portuguese kingdom is based in Brazil. Again, sort of like, think about the implications of, this is, I think, what we call the butterfly effect. Something that happens in one place causes things in other places. And so Napoleon decides to invade most of Europe. Like, if you are not allied to him, he invades you. And so the countries of Europe decide that maybe he's doing too much. For example, in 1812, he decides to invade Russia. And so nobody told him that maybe invading Russia in winter was a bad idea. And so his army of about 600,000 was eventually defeated. They had nothing to eat. And so he actually occupies Moscow. And but then the Russians had kind of followed this scorched earth policy. They burnt everything, and so his army had no housing and then that was one of the worst winters. So this is why we say some people should have read history, especially Hitler, because clearly he didn't read that invading Russia in the winter was a bad idea. So he invades Russia in 1941, and he was 15 kilometers from Moscow. Russian winter came in. But anyway, going back to Napoleon, he is defeated in Waterloo, Belgium, 1815. He is exiled to Elba. Elba is off the Italian coast. But while the leaders of Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and their affiliates are meeting to talk about their new order in Europe, Napoleon escapes the island of Elba and goes back to Paris. And so instead of the generals like arresting him, they are like, oh, you used to be our boss, so maybe we should. So he actually rules France for another 111 days before he is eventually kicked out. And so finally he is exiled to St. Helena. St. Helena is kind of between Brazil and West Africa. So he really was like kicked out, super out there. And so he's going to eventually die in 1821, broken. And so this is kind of the Napoleonic, what the French would call the Napoleonic era, 1799 to 1815. And so after 1815, so one of the reasons that the powers of Europe were meeting in 1815 was to figure out how to make sure that commoners, such as those in France, would not rise up and murder their kings. Because this Napoleonic era kind of really disrupted Europe, the ideas of kings and so on. But so again, if you sort of think about Napoleonic era, the French talk about liberty, equality, and fraternity, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And so a lot of populations kind of initially look at the French as liberators, but again, some resistance, for example, in Portugal, Spain, again, that's Iberian Peninsula, Russia, Germany, Italy. And so when he invades the Iberian Peninsula, again, this is what we are calling the Peninsular War. Spain and Portugal, Iberian Peninsula causes, and then he actually installs his brother as the king of Spain, which of course is going to bring a lot of challenges. So he was very good at part of why Napoleon was so successful in conquest was how he organized his army. And so, for example, he would place horses and supplies every 16 kilometers. 16 kilometers is about 10 miles. And so while other people would be like riding their horses, to the end of the war, his horses would go like 16 miles, and then you had fresh horses. So he was able to conquer. If you think about the distance between France and Moscow, particularly the distance between Spain, which is to the west of France, and Moscow is about 3,000 kilometers. Maybe about 1,400 miles, which is quite a bit of a distance. And so, again, his army couldn't survive the Russian winter. He is defeated in the Battle of Waterloo. And so the Congress of Vienna, as we mentioned, was convened in 1815 to do two things: cooperation to prevent future wars and revolutions, but also the restoration of deposed monarchs. Remember, the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs had to move, but also the French monarch, of course, had been murdered. And so the restoration of deposed monarchs was especially important in trying. So what the kings decided to do was to come to each other's aid if one of them was attacked. But in 1848, there would be an uprising that replaced most of European monarchs. But I want to stay with the Congress of Vienna. So the Congress of Vienna convenes in 1815, and it brings in what is often referred to as the Concert of Europe. So Europe would meet from about 1815 to about 1871. So during that time, there was peace. No country really invaded another country. Well, of course, there were wars, but and so there was what is often thought of as balance of power. So the different European powers balanced each other. They decided to come to each other's aid if there was a war. But then in 1870, 1871, Germany united. Actually, it unites maybe a little earlier than that, and invades France. So this is what most historians will call the Franco-Prussian War. Franco-Prussian War. So Germany and Prussia kind of existed together. You will see, for example, there was Germany and the Kingdom of Prussia. They actually disbanded in 1946. So again, from about 1871, Germany and the Kingdom of Prussia, they become really powerful in Europe and upset the balance. But they also begin to want to conquer other people. When we talk about maybe the next 2 chapters, we'll talk about nations and empires, and we're going to see how, for example, most of European nations go out there to try and form empires. And so, but it's important to remember that the Congress of Vienna brings about a kind of European peace, concert of Europe, cooperation between countries to prevent future wars and revolutions, but also restoration of deposed monarchs. And they are coming to each other's aid when there were commoners rising up to overthrow them. Now, in 1814, so by 1814, Napoleon is kind of being defeated, but then, as we said, he's going to come back. And so 1814, we see the rise of his brother, who took the title of Charles X. And so Charles X remembers that his brother was murdered by the Republicans, and he decides, now we are going to go on a revenge mission. So if you remember, the Republican era was called, introduced the Reign of Terror. The restoration of monarchs introduces what is generally referred to as White Terror. So if you had anything to do with the killing of monarchs, especially Louis XVI, then Charles X came after you. And so, unfortunately, then the Republicans would then say, oh, so this is what monarchs are doing. And so in 1824, but so the French go through a bit of upheavals. Napoleon's cousin will declare himself emperor of the world so he comes to power in 1848 and decides to recreate the French Empire. And so he's the one who actually invades Germany to try and create more French territory like his cousin did, which is why maybe we shouldn't do the things our cousins do sometimes, maybe. And so he invades Germany, but then Germany defeats him and actually takes a whole bunch of French territory, including a province that we're going to call Alsace-Lorraine. Remember it, Alsace-Lorraine, because when he takes it, it's the French province that has the most natural resources. And so the French are going to want their stuff back. And so, of course, Germany is not going to give up the French stuff. The French are going to have to fight for it. So when you think about the First World War, but anyway, so thinking about the Napoleonic world and, eventually what becomes of it, you can sort of see where he conquers. He then also conquers the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. The French Empire goes all the way to Brussels, to what is today Belgium and maybe the Netherlands. Now the Confederation of the Rhine, that is Germany, and then eventually we're going to see the Kingdom of Prussia there. And so the Austrian Empire was opposed to the French. And so you can sort of see where he then goes to Moscow, trying to take over. So he really had dreams of empire that maybe didn't. And so in terms of the Allied states, satellite states, And so if you sort of think about his whole empire, it kind of became really, really huge. And again, in the inset is the Iberian Peninsula. Some of that information, the Portuguese crown moves to Brazil. And so, interestingly, the king returns to Portugal, but his son decides not to return. And so he's left in Brazil, and he declares independence. I put that in air quotes because you sort of think about what's he declaring independence from, his father, maybe, because it's not like the more than 4.5 million Africans who are sent there become independent. In fact, Brazil is one of the last countries to end slavery in 1888. So what is he declaring independence from? But anyway, he creates the Brazilian Empire in 1821. And so Brazil weirdly thinks of Dom Pedro, that was his name, I think Dom Pedro II, as the founding father of Brazil. But he was Portuguese. It's another view of the Napoleonic Empire. And so again, you can see how far he travels. Is defeated within about maybe 15, 16 years. But as I previously mentioned, the French Revolution creates the conditions for the Haitian Revolution. So the whole island of that contains Haiti and the Dominican Republic today was known as Hispaniola. And so the French side was known as Saint-Domingue when it was under the French control. Now, it's important to think about how history shapes modernity. Not sure how much you know about the Dominican Republic. A lot of Americans sometimes travel there. Not to Haiti, interestingly. Please do not travel to Haiti at this time. There's kidnapping and murder and mayhem and other things. But it's also interesting to see that during the days of Hispaniola, the French side actually produced about half of the world's sugar, but also that Hispaniola was divided between the French and the Spaniards. The Spanish were more integrational than the French. So again, remember, 500,000 French, 500,000 African enslaved persons, 30,000 French and 30,000 mulattoes. And so when revolution breaks out in the 1800s, the enslaved Africans rise up against the French and the mulattoes who often owned them. Eventually about 5,000 French are killed. Now there's a bit of other parts to the Haitian Revolution. Remember 1793, the French National Assembly outlaws slavery. And so Haiti becomes independent. Toussaint Louverture is kind of in the mix. Kind of like the person who he was an African of maybe mixed parentage, more African than maybe French. And so again, think about what happens, and this actually also happens in the United States with Abraham Lincoln. If you free the 500,000 people who are in charge of producing the cash crops, what happens? And then everybody goes off and has their own small plot. I know this sounds like apologism for slavery, but so what Toussaint Louverture discovers is that nobody is working anymore. Everyone is free. So the economy begins to and so he decides that maybe some people should be re-enslaved, which is a really crappy thing to do to people didn't really happen. And so Haiti goes through a few years of we don't even know what we are doing. And then Napoleon Bonaparte comes in power, and he's like, we are reestablishing the French Empire. Now, there's a whole bunch of secret agreements that we are not going to talk about that actually give. So maybe we did talk about them a little. So the French get part of like Italy, and the Spaniards give up, or Spain gets part of Italy, and the French give up. No, it's the other way around. The French get Louisiana Purchase, and the Spaniards get part of Italy, Tuscany, in a very weird exchange that was very secret. But so eventually the Louisiana Purchase comes to the French. And so this is part of Napoleon's expansion of the French Empire. And so he's like, wait, remember when we had a colony in Saint-Domingue and we're going back to take it? And so he sends troops to come and reconquer Saint-Domingue, which didn't go very well. The French troops kind of die out of malaria and other tropical diseases, and so Napoleon is like, forget the Western Hemisphere, we are not even going to worry about it. So he withdraws the troops, and this is how he ends up selling the Louisiana Purchase to the United States. So he's now going to focus on building empire in Europe and maybe North Africa. And so by 1803, the Africans there's an uprising of Africans in Saint-Domingue, which will become Haiti. And so Toussaint Louverture is actually still kind of in charge, but he's betrayed by Dessalines. Toussaint Louverture is taken to France, where he dies like in 1803. And so Dessalines is now the guy who is in charge. There was like 2-3 of them, but somehow the others ended up being dead. And so he actually waits for the diseases to kill the French troops and for Napoleon to abandon Saint-Domingue. And then he's like, oh well, they are gone, we are free, we are now going to create a new country, we are going to call it Haiti, and by the way, I am going to become the emperor of the world. Like, yeah, very interesting way to. So anyway, this is part of those explanations. And so in Saint-Domingue, formerly enslaved people take the colony, restore order, Louverture fight for independence. But so initially, other nations refused to recognize Haiti. But again, remember, long before Louverture or Dessalines, this was, a rendering of Vincent Oggi, murdered in like 1791. Slave revolt, rebellion grows. About 5,000, and so this is kind of the progress of the revolution. Now, I mentioned being broken at the wheel. This is one of the renderings of what they think it was, but I maybe take the other view. So nation building, this is Dessalines and all of that stuff where he betrays Toussaint Louverture, sends him to France. And so, again, you can see him being sort of like the new empire. Declares independence in 1804, crowns himself emperor, renames Saint-Domingue into Haiti, and then he's assassinated 2 years later, which is sort of like some of the current troubles in Haiti stem from the assassination of the president, I forget his name, in 2021. And then since then, it's been a whole bunch of. One of the Haitian leaders who I think took over after that assassination was actually deposed while he was in Kenya. Came back and couldn't land back in Haiti. So that is. Anyway, so we are beginning to see revolutions. American Revolution, 1776, Declaration of Independence, and then the British tried to reconquer their territory. They are defeated in 1783, the French Revolution, now the Haitian Revolution, and so now we actually begin to see revolutions beginning to take hold. So Haiti becomes independent in 1804, and other countries are beginning to say, well, maybe we should revolt against our overlords. And so in Spanish and Portuguese New World, you're going to begin to see a cascade of revolutions, beginning with Mexico in 1811. Father Hidalgo is kind of one of those individuals associated with the Mexican Revolution. And so from about 1821, you're going to see most of South America become independent, actually beginning with Mexico. And then like Bolivia, Venezuela, Colombia. And so a lot of this comes from not necessarily the enslaved people, but maybe the Creole class. So South America had like a whole bunch of, and we saw some of these designations: Creoles, Zambos, Pardos, and so on. But so we do see some people of color trying to gain rights, but most of the other revolutions are going to be led by indigenous peoples, even though the indigenous revolts are kind of put down very quickly. So people like Tupac Katari, Tupac Amaru, but we also begin to see the new sort of elites who own estates and other things. So remember, the European rulers are not that many. Even though we talked about Dom Pedro II kind of declaring independence from his father, it's more of maybe the local, I would call them peninsulares, Creoles, and so on. And so, for example, as I mentioned, Brazil is one of those kinds of, but so Brazil really, at least that declaration of empire in 1821 had no violence. It was like the Brazilian, the Portuguese king was like, oh, Napoleon is dead, so maybe I can go back to. Now, of course, he had appointed his brother, and there were questions of how do you get rid of these new rulers. But so the Dom Pedro I goes back to Portugal, and so his son is left in Pedro in charge in Rio de Janeiro. And so again, it's the independence of Brazil. To me, it's like it really doesn't happen in 1821-22, more like 1888, when the black populations are. And so this is Dom Pedro II declares Brazil independent. He was like 7, so it's not like he was even old. And so he rules until like 1888, dies maybe 1889, the year after like Brazil actually becomes abolishes slavery. And so if you actually think about the reign of Dom Pedro II, Brazil imports about maybe 350,000 enslaved Africans from about 1850 to about 1888. Now I want you to remember that this is the period of time when the US and Britain are patrolling the sea lanes from Africa to the New World and capturing slaving ships and actually freeing people. And so this is when Brazil is actually increasing its slavery situation. But also from about 1840, Brazil discovered that it's a very good growing location for coffee, and so actually shifts from sugar and other products and really focuses on growing coffee. And so again, I question, and I want you to question some of these narratives about, for example, Brazil's independence from his father. And to me, that's not. Now, Mexico, as I mentioned, was began its march to independence in 1811. But again, some of these march to independence efforts are led by local Creoles who are opposed to Peninsulares. So, for example, when Napoleon takes over Spain and Portugal, he sends a governor to Mexico, and Mexicans are like, maybe this is a time to declare independence. And so actually part of Mexico's independence is opposition. Like, they were loyal to the Spanish monarchy, and they're like, why are we being now ruled by the French? And so eventually it's, the Creole group declares independence, but again, independence doesn't come through until 1821, and it's useful to remember which areas that we are talking about. The map on the left, particularly of Mexico, doesn't probably show us maybe the proper size of New Spain, because New Mexico was part of that. But Mexico becomes independent in 1821, and so if you actually look at how quickly the South American nations become independent, so like there was a confederacy of where you find, for example, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. There was a confederacy of Central American states that eventually declares independence in like 1830s. What you see as Ecuador, Colombia used to be and maybe Venezuela used to be the Viceroyalty of New Granada. But Venezuela eventually becomes independent. You will remember Simon Bolivar, who was actually in Venezuela rather than Bolivia, which is named after him. But again, there was then the Brazilian kingdom that we mentioned became independent in 1822, but becomes a republic in 1889. So to me, that is the real independence that also brings in Africa. So other countries like Bolivia become independent in 1825. Again, this is part of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Viceroyalty of La Plata, which included Uruguay and Paraguay and parts of Argentina, declares independence from about 1810. Now, I want you to maybe keep in mind that when these regions declare independence, their home empires. So, for example, Spain sends troops to try and get all of these empires back. But again, Spain had kind of become weakened, so they didn't have the ability to send and supply troops to the New World. So eventually, and then especially in Chile, people would move to the mountains, and the Spanish troops would be like, well, how do we fight people who are hiding in the mountains? So eventually the Spanish and Portuguese, especially the Spanish, kind of eventually gave up. Now, I briefly mentioned some of those confusing terms, and maybe it's useful to think about them. So Peninsulares were the full-blooded Spaniards who were born in Spain and moved to the New World. And so if you think about the class system of especially South America, Peninsulares were at the top of the chain, and then you had like the Creoles, and you can see how, for example, they are spelled with Criollo or Creole, Creole, and then there's the other designations: mulattoes, mestizos, zambos. Now, Codillos were really generally leaders, maybe political military leaders who ruled most of South America. If you actually think about the Argentinian president right now, or the immediate former Brazilian president Jair Bolsonaro, those are the kinds of leaders who I would call them muscular. They are almost like dictators. And so Latin America had a lot of those. Countries such as, I think it was maybe Venezuela, that had about 41 leaders between 1830 and 1899. So a lot of these were overthrowing each other. But so again, sort of think about these terms in reference to Latin America. So we see these revolutions. So Simon Bolivar, as I mentioned, and Jose de San Martin are. So if you sort of think about the people who begin the South American revolutions, other than Father Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico, you will often hear Simon Bolivar. And so Simon Bolivar has a republic named after him, Bolivia. But also if you think about how they are regarded, for example, Venezuela is officially known as the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. So Bolivar, again associated with. Now, Jose de San Martin was also a very significant leader, and there's this meeting that is spoken of when they met in, it could have been 1825 or maybe 1829. And so the idea was to unite Latin America, because especially the Spanish parts. But again, that didn't come to anything because there were very significant local disagreements. But so when you sort of think about Latin America, even though they become independent, they don't necessarily find peace. And so you see new civil wars. But again, sort of think about the place of the formerly enslaved Africans or concurrently enslaved Africans. So for example, in Brazil, they didn't become independent until 1889. In Cuba, slavery went on until so Brazil's slavery ended in 1888. Cuba was actually the last country to abolish slavery officially in 1889. So again, think about the African populations, but also think about the indigenous populations. So for example, the native, American peoples in these republics and their place. Even today, we still actually see how governments struggle with this. An example is Brazil. Actually, Bolivia is one of those great examples. Bolivia has had one indigenous president. I forget his name, but he was actually very modest. But so again, the question of appropriations of land, the new republics versus the indigenous peoples, but also the African population. So for example, I hear, because I don't know if I want to ever go there, Colombia is 40% of Colombia's population is African descendant. But so if you think about power, 40% is a significant population, but you never find that Colombia has had like a person of African descent as its leader. Now, maybe I forget what country Nayib Bukele is from. Maybe he's from Colombia, but he's actually maybe descendant from Lebanese. So again, you think about colorism in Latin America, and also the question of indigenous peoples. And so these are things that have not been necessarily resolved. In terms of independence, these are the dates on which they attained independence. Now, Suriname, it's weird that the Netherlands had territory in the Americas. But interestingly, the French. Now imagine where France is, like right in the middle of Europe. France has territory in South America, like northern South America, next to Suriname in Guyana. It's called French Guyana. It's not independent. It's what the French call a département, like a department of the French, like an overseas department, together with islands like Reunion and some others like in the near Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea. And so again, if you sort of think about the implications of colonialism, of imperialism, and so on, you begin to see. Now, you have probably been hearing about Panama a bit, and whether we are going to take that canal. So Panama was a creation of the United States. Panama was split from Colombia in order to create the Panama Canal, because Colombia was like, yeah, maybe we should have a canal somewhere, and so the United States was like, it's taking too long, and so Panama was encouraged to secede, and so then the canal was built. And now we are trying to figure out if we should maybe do something about it. So instead of pivoting back to a continent that we are maybe more less familiar with, we are going to stop here for now.